I'm sharing my story not to solicit sympathy or guidance. The events that have transpired are part of my life, and I neither need nor seek advice or pity. All my life, I've been unwaveringly loyal and held marriage in the highest regard, perhaps even excessively so. I never strayed from my wife because to me, she was the only one, and I never felt the desire to, despite numerous advances from other women. I first encountered my future wife in the early 90s at a friend's wedding. It was love at first sight. We courted for 6 months before tying the knot. Our wedding was simple, but our joy was boundless. It was her second marriage, having divorced her previous husband a year prior to our meeting. Something had gone awry in her first marriage, but I never pried into her past, and she seldom spoke of it. My wife is stunning, intelligent, and an exceptional homemaker. I consider myself truly fortunate. When we married, the country was in turmoil, and stable jobs were scarce. She worked as a medic on a military base, while I juggled my main job with 2 side gigs, and we managed quite well. My priority was to provide for my family. From the moment we met, I cherished her, loved her deeply, and treated her with the utmost care. She was my closest confidant and the dearest person in my life. After 2 years of marriage, we still had no children, which deeply distressed her. She feared I would abandon her due to her infertility. Her diagnosis of blocked fallopian tubes was a devastating blow. However, I did not waver. I stood by her, offering support and reassurance, telling her that she was my fate, and I loved her more than anything. I vowed to do everything within my power to help her become a mother, because I believed in the capabilities of modern medicine. She trusted me, and for her smile, I was willing to give everything to ensure her happiness. During that period, I toiled tirelessly because I had a goal, and I was resolute in achieving it. We constantly needed funds for medical examinations, consultations, medications, and surgeries in various clinics. We even sought out numerous healers. Each time, I believed that this would be the time it worked and my wife would finally conceive, and then we would truly start living. However, despite all our efforts, nothing seemed to work. Almost 5 years slipped by, and my wife lost all hope, resigning herself to our situation. Yet I remained the eternal optimist, never giving up. I continued to believe in miracles, and my energy bolstered my wife's spirits. She often said she felt at ease with me and could look to the future with confidence. I believed her because I felt she was the one I was destined to live my life for. She was my rock and my unbreakable fortress. As long as she was by my side, I felt invincible. One day, we stumbled upon an article about a human reproduction institute and the potential of artificial insemination. This notion rekindled our hope and fueled our drive to achieve our cherished dream. I was ready to move mountains and more certain than ever that this would be the solution. The operation and the rehabilitation period were exorbitantly expensive by our standards then, so I began searching for ways to earn the necessary funds. Our small town didn't offer many opportunities, but I discovered an ad in a magazine. Reservists wanted, promising good pay and other benefits. They were recruiting for specific tasks in particular locations and offered substantial compensation. Having served in the Marine Corps and being in good health, I saw this as a viable option. Although I wasn't driven by patriotic fervor, I didn't mind taking the job because I needed the resources to reach our goal. After careful consideration, I decided to take the risk. My wife wept and didn't want me to go, fearing that if something happened to me, the money wouldn't matter. I explained to her that we weren't born into millionaire families, and nothing would be handed to us for free. We had to take charge of our destiny. I reassured her that everything would be fine, and that the money was for a noble cause. I ventured to distant lands, was away from home for long periods, but returned with the funds we needed. I was fortunate. I survived unscathed and without compromising my conscience. Then my wife and I went to the institute, had the procedure, and a miracle occurred. My wife became pregnant. I was elated and pampered her endlessly. Soon, our daughter was born, and we were in bliss. I felt like I was soaring, working hard, and helping my wife with the baby. I did all the household chores, which brought me immense joy. My wife called me a perpetual motion machine, and I genuinely wanted to envelop her and our daughter with care. I had boundless energy. Soon, I secured a stable, well-paying job. I dressed my wife in the finest clothes, bought her a car, and we moved into a larger apartment. We vacationed by the seaside every year, spent all our free time together, and I constantly devised activities to keep my girls entertained. Outings in nature, movies, skiing, ice skating, and more. Reflecting on those days, it felt as though our truckload of candies had finally overturned, and we had earned it. 14 years of what I believed to be a blissful life passed. Our daughter grew up, and family always remained my top priority. Everything I did was for my loved ones. Life never seemed dull or monotonous. Our family never experienced scandals. Out of respect for my wife, I avoided even minor actions that could cause her dissatisfaction. If something trivial bothered her, I was the first to compromise. I always aimed to make her feel cherished as a woman. I can't recall a single day when I didn't tell her how much I loved and valued her. Even during our modest years, I always found ways to surprise her with flowers, gifts, and little girly trinkets. She always appreciated that. Our intimate life was also on point. I wasn't conservative, and I believed we were entirely open and trusting with each other. I tried to be attentive to all her needs, and from my perspective, everything was harmonious. She always assured me she was satisfied and that I met all her expectations. As for jealousy, it was a non-issue. She never gave me any reason to be jealous, even though she worked as a medic on a military base, predominantly surrounded by men. My job occasionally required short business trips, lasting 1 to 2 weeks. I always eagerly anticipated returning home to my beloved, and she consistently greeted me with joy and warmth. Then life threw us a curveball, like something straight out of a movie or a joke. Once I flew out on a business trip, and during a layover, I received a message from my colleagues that the job was canceled. So I had to head back home. I arrived in our city during the day, bought a large bouquet of roses and a bottle of champagne, and decided to surprise my wife without telling her I was coming back. According to my calculations, she would still be at work, and our daughter would be at school. I took a taxi home and tried to open the door with my key, but it was locked from the inside. I thought, well, the surprise didn't go as planned. I rang the doorbell, but there was no response. I rang again, and began to worry, not understanding what was happening. I was about to call the police when I finally heard my wife's voice asking, "Who's there?" I said, "Honey, are you trying to scare me?" "It's me. The trip was canceled." I even thought she might be sleeping or unwell. But when she opened the door, I didn't recognize her. She seemed like a different person. Her eyes were distant, looking through me as if I wasn't there. I walked into the hallway and through the open door to the living room, saw a military officer sitting in a chair. Only then did I notice that my wife was in a robe with nothing underneath. Suddenly, everything became clear. She calmly said, "You're bleeding." I saw that I had gripped the bouquet of roses so tightly that the thorns had pierced my fingers. For the first time in my life, my legs shook so badly that I just sat down on the floor by the door. It's hard to describe what I felt at that moment. I couldn't breathe. My head was a whirlwind of thoughts, and it all felt like a nightmare. I couldn't believe my eyes. It seemed like this couldn't be happening to me because my wife wasn't capable of such a thing. Then she said, "We need to talk. I hope you won't make a scene. He's not to blame." But I couldn't even stand up at that moment, let alone cause a scene. If I had been consumed with anger, I might have done something irreversible, but now I realize it's a good thing I didn't. I didn't see how he quietly slipped out of the apartment. My wife and I were left alone. She knelt before me and said, "This happens in life," and burst into tears. I remember fragments of what she said. "I can't live like this anymore. I'm confused. I want to confess to you. You're a good person. I'm a bad one. I don't deserve you." Then she started recounting all the times she had cheated on me throughout our life together. It felt like she wanted to annihilate me. She continued, explaining that the first time was with her ex-husband early in our relationship, just after we had started dating. She said she met him intentionally and slept with him to show him what he had lost. Then she cheated on me with some military medic in another city during a professional training course. She said she did it out of pity because he was very romantic, suffering after a recent divorce, and would read her poems. Then there was another military doctor in our city, and so on, culminating with the last affair with the officer I had found in our home. She said their affair had lasted almost a month, and she had wanted to end it, but hadn't managed to yet. They always met at work, and she felt terrible for desecrating our home. After hearing her out, I asked, "Why did you do this to me?" She broke down in hysterics, saying she couldn't explain her actions, calling it an inexplicable passion, and admitting there was no justification. She said the decision was now mine to make and swore that if I could forgive her, she would be faithful until death. For the first few days, I was in a daze. I couldn't sleep or eat, wandering through my routine like a robot. At night, I would sweat profusely, drink water, and smoke incessantly. I avoided alcohol. My colleagues noticed something was amiss and asked what had happened, saying I looked like a shadow of myself. My wife saw my torment, crying and begging for forgiveness. I had no words for her, staying silent and lost. My mind was in turmoil. Later, I often tried to talk to her, to share my feelings like before, to tell her how much I loved her, but the words wouldn't come. There was always a lump in my throat that I couldn't swallow or spit out. 6 months went by. During that time, I kept replaying our life together, searching for answers within myself. I wondered if it was my fault, if I had done something wrong. Guilt consumed me. During this period, I became emotionally and physically distant from my wife. The thought of intimacy with her didn't even cross my mind. I was afraid of sex with her, feeling inadequate, and thinking there was no point in embarrassing myself in bed. We communicated about everyday matters, and I remained attentive to our daughter as always. She was entering her teenage years, and I didn't want to hurt her since she was innocent in all this. Eventually, the emotions subsided, and the pain in my soul eased a bit. One day, I decided to talk to my wife. I told her that I harbored no anger or resentment, that I still loved her deeply and was willing to go through fire and water for her. I admitted that the events had probably changed something in me, but I wasn't sure what exactly, and it would take time to understand. I asked her to promise that if life with me became unsatisfactory, she would tell me immediately. I said I wouldn't hold her back. There's no point in wasting time. Life is short, and it could still turn out differently with someone else. We became close again, but it wasn't the same. I tried to be as I was before, but in bed with my wife, I started having inexplicable problems with potency, which only fueled my self-criticism. Another 6 years passed, and family remained my top priority. I stopped questioning whether she was cheating on me or not. She remained beautiful, intelligent, an excellent homemaker, and a good mother. Yes, I forgave her, but something inside me broke. My soul was scorched, leaving an emptiness, a poison that had seeped into my bones. My unbreakable bastion had crumbled like a house of cards, and there was no feeling of newness. Over time, I became a different person. The true meaning of the word betrayal is that everything changes, and I had changed. I would smile remembering those days when I wandered through distant lands, earning money to have our daughter. Back then, on my load-bearing vest, I had written the phrase, "What doesn't kill us makes us stronger." Eventually, the internal burden that had weighed me down for so long suddenly lifted. It's quite odd, really. I tried to understand what had prevented me from changing my life earlier. I don't know. I had always been an optimist, believing that everything would settle down and be okay. And it did settle, but along with that, something very important left my soul. Something that had given meaning to our marriage, that motivated me to move forward. My foolish sense of responsibility dictated that I couldn't just leave, because that would be betrayal. But it happened. No, not betrayal, but my attitude toward everything that had happened shifted, and I no longer felt like a traitor. One morning, I woke up and suddenly realized that my internal changes had come to an end. As if waking from a stupor, I understood that I had been living someone else's life for a long time, not my own. Looking at my wife, who was sleeping beside me, I realized that I no longer knew this woman. That day, I left the house, turned off my phone, drove around the city, stood by the roadside, and wandered through the forest. It's hard to explain, but I felt a sense of liberation, like a bird escaping its cage. It felt like I had paid for all my mistakes in full. I thought and reminisced, increasingly realizing my newfound freedom. In the evening, I returned home and told my wife everything. We had a long conversation without reproaches. She cried and said she had been expecting this day all along. Strangely, I no longer felt pity for her. I explained my understanding of life at that moment, and she shared hers. She repeatedly asked for forgiveness, and I told her that I had long forgiven her, but I was no longer the person she had married. We had lived almost 23 years together. The first 15 years before the turning point were lived solely for her and our daughter, and the following 8 years I can barely remember. Throughout this time, I never reproached her for anything. I endured it all within myself. But during this period, many things changed, primarily my understanding and attitude toward everything. I realized that continuing our marriage was a waste of time. Our daughter had grown up and was almost ready to leave the nest. My wife accepted it. I think she understood that our paths had long since diverged, and we were merely walking side by side out of inertia. But objectively, there were good times in our life. While I was in the dark, nothing else existed for me, and I was happy. We divorced, and I explained everything to our daughter, who was old enough to understand. We continue to see each other more often than with my ex-wife. Life goes on, and the emptiness that echoed in my soul for so long no longer echoes. I don't have a permanent woman in my life, and I'm afraid I don't want one. Now I know for sure, what doesn't kill us right away makes us disabled.